The shuttle bay was cold enough that I could see my breath, which felt wrong somehow. We were 300 light-years from the nearest weather system, and I was standing in a breath cloud like a man waiting for a bus in January. Behind me, 8 people I barely knew were checking their gear for the 4th time in 2 hours. Nobody was talking. That told me more about the situation than any briefing had. My name is Rourke Callahan. I'm a child welfare enforcement officer out of the Interplanetary Treaty Bureau, which sounds impressive until you realize the Bureau has 47 employees and a budget that couldn't afford a second shuttle. What I actually do in practice is track missing children across jurisdictional lines, human children who end up somewhere a human court can't easily reach. Before the Reach Accord was signed, this happened with uncomfortable frequency. Colonial boundary disputes, custody cases that crossed system lines, trafficking operations that used the legal gray space between Earth's jurisdiction and wherever the next settlement was. I'd spent 8 years chasing children through jurisdictional gaps. This was different. This was 41 children, gone in a single night, all between the ages of 6 and 11, from 3 separate colonies across 2 systems, taken with such precision that some of the parents hadn't noticed until morning. The oldest was named Marcus, and he was 11, and he had apparently tried to stop whatever happened by putting himself between his 8-year-old sister and the entry point. And whatever had come through, the entry point had moved him out of the way without hurting him, which was noted in the incident report as possibly the most frightening part of the entire event. Something that could have hurt him and chose not to was operating according to a logic that didn't include him as a relevant variable. There was no ransom demand, no manifesto, no diplomatic channel through which someone poked their head and said, "Here is why we did this, here is what we want." Just absence, perfectly shaped, like something had reached down and removed exactly the children it was looking for. The hegemony had been contacted through official channels within 6 hours. Their response arrived in 4 minutes, which was almost insultingly fast, as if they'd had it drafted already. The response said, in the careful grammatical architecture of their diplomatic band, that the children were being studied, that the study was important, that the study served a purpose larger than the feelings of any individual species, that humanity should be patient. Patient. I read that word in the briefing document and had to set the document down for a moment. The UN Parliament met in emergency session for 9 hours. I know people on the outside expected the emergency session to produce warships, or at minimum, a demand with teeth behind it. What they got instead was quiet, methodical specificity. 9 hours of argument about what, exactly, the most effective response would be, given what the hegemony was and what we were, and what the Reach Accord actually said. Then they sent 9 people. I want to explain what that means, because to someone outside the event it might sound small. It might even sound like a failure of ambition, 41 children taken, and the human response is 9 people in a shuttle. But you have to understand what those 9 people were, and what the decision to send exactly those 9 people said about whoever had made the decision. The woman across from me, currently running a calibration check on a device the size of a paperback book that she'd built herself in the 14 hours between the briefing and departure, was Dr. Sira Akafer. She held a chair in xenocognitive studies at University of Lagos and had published 47 papers on hegemony, neural architecture, and decision processing. More specifically, she understood how they thought, how they categorized, how they decided what things were worth doing and what things were worth stopping. She'd spent 11 years inside their academic literature, which almost no human had bothered to learn to read, and she could predict their administrative behavior with a consistency that made their own diplomats uncomfortable when they encountered her work. Her device was a portable chemical spectrum analyzer that could detect and partially decode hegemony pheromonal signaling, the emotional language that ran under everything they said out loud, real-time emotional intelligence on a being that didn't emote the way humans emoted. She'd built it herself in 14 hours, because it hadn't existed before we got the briefing. The man behind her, quiet and eating something from a foil pouch as though we were on a camping trip, was Lev Minsky. He was a child psychologist who'd worked 2 tours in colony trauma units after the Reacher Station evacuation, and again after the Colt 7 mine collapse. He wasn't here because anyone expected the children to be in perfect shape when we found them. He was here because whoever found them first needed to know exactly how to handle the next 90 minutes, because the 90 minutes after a child is returned to safety are some of the most psychologically significant of their life, and getting them wrong can extend the recovery by years. He was here because humanity, when it sent people to do something, sent the specific person for the specific thing rather than a general purpose someone who'd figure it out. There was a lawyer named Fatima Al-Rawi who had argued interspecies rights cases in 3 different judicial systems and won 2 of them outright, with the 3rd resulting in a binding precedent that had been cited 6 times since. There was a xenobiologist named Thijs van der Berg who'd published the only extant human-authored study on hegemony biological ethics, a document so thorough that it had been cited in 2 hegemony academic indices, which almost never happened with human work. There was a cryptographic linguist named Yue who had spent 4 years decoding hegemony secondary communication protocols, the layer underneath the diplomatic band that their own junior officials used for internal discussion and assumed no outsider could follow. There was a trauma surgeon named Bashir who held certification in alien medical practice from 2 treaty systems and had performed successful procedures on 3 species that weren't his own. There was Danielle Sato, a former colony security chief who'd run 2 extraction operations in disputed space and knew how to move children through uncertain environments without increasing their fear. There was an engineer named Obi who had clearances I didn't ask about and carried a case of equipment that he'd agreed not to open unless things went in a direction nobody wanted. And there was me. We were not soldiers. The Bureau had made that explicit in the briefing, with the kind of explicit that means someone argued about it for a long time before the decision got made. No weapons capable of breaching a pressure hull. No electronic warfare packages. Nothing that broadcast, in any frequency the hegemony's sensors might read, the word threat. What we had instead was expertise, so precise it was almost aggressive. I'd done the math on it in the shuttle, in the long stretches between the briefings and the planning sessions. Across the 9 of us, we had a combined total of close to 200 years of specific, focused, practiced expertise in fields that were directly relevant to exactly this situation. Not general intelligence, not broad competence. The precise knowledge required to handle every foreseeable problem in this specific negotiation, assembled deliberately and deployed as a unit. Humanity had had 72 hours between the moment the children were taken and the moment we docked at Kurath 7. In that time, someone, and I never found out who, which I think was intentional, had mapped every variable in the situation, identified every tool that would be needed, and located the 9 best humans alive for those tools. That's not slow. That's the speed of a species that has been doing emergency response since before it had written language. The shuttle's intercom clicked. Final approach to Hegemony Station Kurath 7. All passengers are advised that we are entering registered hegemony sovereign space. Standard treaty protocols apply. I looked at the 8 people around me. Sira Akafer had finished her calibration and was sitting very still with her eyes closed, which I'd learned over the previous 48 hours meant she was running scenario trees in her head. Modeling behavior, anticipating responses, filing likely outcomes in order of probability so she could navigate them without needing to think in the moment. Lev Minsky had put away his food pouch and was reviewing something on a small screen. I could see from the angle that it was a list of names, 41 of them. He was memorizing them. He was going to use them. Fatima al-Rawi had her treaty documents open physical paper, which was deliberate, because the hegemony had a specific cultural relationship with physical documents that digital displays didn't trigger. Their own administrative tradition used material documents as signatures of seriousness. She was holding them like a prop, like a signal, even though she didn't need to read them. She had the relevant sections memorized to the word. I thought about the 47 hours of translation lag before the next official hegemony response was due. I thought about 41 children waking up somewhere that smelled wrong and sounded wrong and had no windows they could see through, and a parent somewhere who'd been told to be patient and had spent 3 days trying to figure out what that meant. And I thought about the fact that we were here in under 72 hours, which by interstellar diplomatic standards was approximately the speed of sound. The hegemony had likely not expected that. I want to take a moment here to explain the hegemony, because they don't translate well into the shorthand humans tend to use for species like them. They called themselves that, the word translated as something closer to first authority, or more than correct government, though their own linguists used hegemony in English because they'd done their research and understood the weight of the word. They were old. Not old the way humans meant it when they said a civilization was old, where they meant a few thousand years of continuous record. The hegemony's unbroken administrative continuity went back 400,000 years, and they knew it, and they considered it both a credential and a fact of nature the way humans considered the sun rising. 400,000 years. For context, modern humans have existed as a biological category for roughly 300,000 years. The hegemony had been a functioning, bureaucratically organized civilization for longer than our species has existed as a species. They had encountered maybe 30 other species in that time. 14 of those encounters had ended in what the hegemony's historical record listed as correction events, which was their term for what humans would call extinction-level interventions. The records were clinical. The interventions had been conducted when a species showed characteristics the hegemony classified as incompatible with administrative stability, which in practice seemed to mean any species that pushed back in a way the hegemony found difficult to absorb. The other 16 species were still around, in varying degrees of autonomy. The ones who communicated with outsiders described the hegemony the way survivors described the thing they survived, carefully, with attention to detail, without excess emotion, making sure you understood exactly what they were telling you so you didn't make the mistake of misunderstanding. Humanity had been on the hegemony's catalog for about 60 years. We were, by their assessment, a young species with interesting neurochemistry, a somewhat alarming rate of technological adoption, and a social complexity that their xenological division had been unable to fully model, which in their internal documentation they listed as a data gap rather than a point of interest. The Reach Accord had given us formal diplomatic recognition, which in hegemony terms meant they acknowledged we existed, and had agreed not to remove us from any planets we were already on without advance notice of at least 1 year. This was considered, by every other species who dealt with the hegemony, an extraordinarily good outcome for a species our age. None of that history had stopped someone in their research structure from deciding that 41 human children, all apparently presenting some neurological characteristic that appeared in only a small percentage of the human population, constituted a study opportunity that outweighed whatever objections the human governmental apparatus might have. Curath 7 resolved in the viewport as a disk of dark metal larger than I expected, ringed with structures that my eyes kept trying to read as something familiar and kept failing. It wasn't that the station was bizarre. It was that it was built according to a logic that had no particular interest in human spatial intuition, and the result was something that looked like a deliberate affront without actually being one. It was just what happened when you built things for 400,000 years, without ever asking what a human would think of the design. We docked without incident. The docking tube was cold and smelled of something sharp and mineral, like a freshly cut circuit board left in open air. 4 hegemony officials were waiting for us. I want to be precise about what hegemony officials look like, because the briefings humans receive are often imprecise in ways that matter. They are bipedal, which is a coincidence that apparently surprises humans more than it surprises the hegemony. Bilateral symmetry and upright locomotion turn out to be something several independent evolutionary lines arrive at, given the right conditions. They are taller than humans by about 30%, with a bone structure that suggests a lower gravity origin. Their faces are not expressive in ways human faces are expressive, which is not because they have no emotions, but because their emotional signaling is largely chemical. The relevant sensors are not in their faces. Their cast markings, bioluminescent striations at the temporal regions, indicated administrative significance, which meant they had the authority to receive us but not necessarily to resolve anything. This was a deliberate choice on the hegemony's part. Sending people with insufficient authority is a negotiating tool, because it forces the other party to make their initial arguments to someone who can't respond definitively, which allows the hegemony to see what cards are on the table before they put theirs down. Sira Akefer stepped to the front. She spoke in hegemony primary, which is not a language most humans learn, because it takes approximately 8 years of serious study to become functional in it. It lacks the kind of grammatical shortcuts that make language acquisition forgiving. Its tense structure encodes certainty gradations that English doesn't have, which means that every statement in primary carries embedded information about how confident the speaker is about what they're saying, and saying something with the wrong certainty grade is the linguistic equivalent of lying. Sira had been functional in it for 7 years. She had native-level certainty grading, which was something almost no non-hegemony speaker achieved. What she said, translated into English, was something like, "We are the designated response unit for the matter of 41 ward-age humans currently in your facility. We are here under Reach Accord Provision 12C, subparagraph 11, which covers welfare verification of dependent beings under cross-jurisdictional holding. We would like to begin verification within 2 of your administrative hours." The phrasing mattered. She hadn't said please, and she hadn't framed it as a request. She'd framed it as a statement of what was going to happen, graded at the certainty level reserved for things that are established facts rather than desires. In primary, you could hear the difference. The officials conferred, pheromonal exchange probably in a range below what my ears caught. Sira's device was running. One of them responded. She listened without reacting. Then she said something back shorter. "What did they say?" I asked quietly. "They said the children are not available for verification because the study is ongoing. An interruption would compromise data integrity." "And you said?" I said I understood their concern and wanted to discuss Accord Provision 12C in detail, because I believe they may be applying it to the wrong subparagraph. I said I was looking forward to a productive clarification session. She paused. I graded that last sentence at the certainty level for things that will definitely occur. Lev Minsky made a very small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Fatima Al-Rawi opened her documents and held them readable from the official's position without appearing to display them. The physical paper, the signal that said, "We did not come here to talk. We came here with the actual work already done." The lead official looked at her, then at the documents, then at Sira. His temporal markings flickered in a pattern Sira would later identify as something between recalibration and alertness. He exchanged something with the others that didn't last long. Then we were escorted inside. Hegemony interior architecture is functional in the same way that the outside of their stations is functional, meaning It optimizes for their needs and treats any other consideration as irrelevant. The corridors were wide but low-ceilinged in a way that wasn't uncomfortable for humans, but was clearly not designed for them. The lighting was shifted toward a range that suited their visual biology, which meant it looked slightly greenish to us and was slightly dimmer than we would have preferred. The temperature was 4 degrees below human comfort range. None of these things were hostile, they were simply indifferent. We were taken to a meeting room that looked like a storage antechamber with a table added. Sierra had told us in the briefing this was deliberate, that the hegemony's protocol assigned meeting space quality in direct proportion to the assessed significance of the meeting. A storage antechamber meant they assessed our meeting as low significance. She had also told us it didn't matter. We weren't here to negotiate status. We were here to negotiate outcome. A senior official arrived 20 minutes later. His caste markings indicated Research Administrative Superior, which was a rank that meant he had authority to speak for the department responsible for the children. He had been assigned the diplomatic designation factor Curath 7 row for our interaction. He was taller than the 4 who'd met us at the docking tube, and his movements had a particular economy that I'd learned to associate with beings who had spent a long time at the top of a hierarchy. He did not rush. He had, from the moment he entered the room, the posture of someone who expected to be the most significant person in any room he walked into, and had no particular reason to believe this room would be different. We sat, Sierra spoke. The first hour of what followed was about establishing the legal framework. Fatima's documents came into play almost immediately. The research exception the hegemony was citing was in the accord. It was real. It existed. It had been negotiated into the treaty for legitimate reasons. But the exception carried conditions, and those conditions had specific language. And Fatima had spent 8 months in hegemony legal archives finding 2 documents, internal hegemony jurisprudence, predating the accord by 30,000 years, that defined the relevant terms in ways the accord drafters had been referencing without knowing it. The argument she was making was not that the hegemony had no right to conduct research. The argument was more specific and therefore more dangerous than that. The research exception required that the study not constitute harm to the study subjects under the standards defined in hegemony biological ethics. Their own standards, not human ones, and the definition of harm in their own biological ethics framework, as established in documents older than most human civilizations, included psychological distress of a degree that compromised the subject's developmental trajectory. She wasn't arguing that what they'd done was wrong by human standards. She was arguing that it was wrong by hegemony standards. She was using their own 400,000-year ethical tradition against them. Factor Rowe argued back through the translation interface. He was good at this, precise, unhurried, with a facility for finding the weak point in a framing and inserting a reinterpretation that shifted the burden of proof. He had done this for a long time with a lot of species, and he was practiced. Sierra translated everything. She did not editorialize. She did not soften. She rendered his arguments with the same precision she rendered ours, because she wanted us to hear exactly what he was saying. What he was saying, at core, was that the psychological distress threshold in the documents Fatima had cited applied to study subjects of species with recognized sapience standing under hegemony classification, and that humanity's sapience classification was still under review at the junior level of the hegemony xenological registry, and therefore the threshold didn't technically apply. Which was extraordinary. They'd taken our children specifically because they were human children, because human neurological development had something they wanted to study, and now they were arguing that humans weren't sapient enough for their own welfare laws to protect. Fatima didn't react. She turned to a specific page of her documents. "The sapience classification system you're referencing," she said through Sierra, "was established in the administrative record of the Third Expanded Council. Is that correct? Factor Row confirmed it was. The current version of that record, Revision 47, amended in your year calendar equivalent of approximately 3,000 years ago, includes a provision that any species granted diplomatic recognition under a formal treaty instrument is automatically assigned provisional sapient status for the duration of any legal proceeding arising from the treaty. She indicated the document. Humanity received formal diplomatic recognition under the Reach Accord. This proceeding arises from the Accord. Provisional sapient status applies. The room was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. Factor Row's temporal markings did something Sierra would later describe as the hegemony equivalent of a very subtle eye movement, the kind that happens when someone realizes the ground under their argument just changed. He said something in primary that didn't translate cleanly, and Sierra rendered it as, "That provision has not been applied in approximately 800 years. It is still in the record," Fatima said. "Revision 47 has not been superseded." Another pause. Thijs van der Berg had been quiet for the first hour. He spoke now, and what he introduced was not legal. It was empirical. He had the children's biometric monitoring data from the colony stations, transmitted in the hours before we left, sleep cycles, cortisol proxies, neurological stress markers. The children had been removed from home, placed in an unfamiliar environment, separated from their parents, and kept in conditions that the hegemony had attempted to make comfortable without any actual understanding of what human children needed. The data showed 72 hours of continuous elevated stress response across all 41 subjects. "I want to talk about your data," Thijs said through the translation interface. "Not ours, yours. If you've been studying these children for 72 hours, your instruments have been reading the same markers mine are reading. You're not getting clean neurological data from a population in acute stress response. Your study results are compromised by the conditions of the study." Factor Row was very still. "I can show you the correction factors you'd need to apply," Thijs continued. "But I want to be honest with you. The correction factors don't fully recover the data quality because the confound is ongoing. If data quality is the objective, the most efficient path is intervention in the stress response, which requires parental contact, which requires access, which is what we're asking for." He said it without accusation. He said it like a researcher talking to another researcher about a methodology problem they'd both like to solve. He was, in the most literal sense, helping them understand why giving us what we wanted was in their scientific interest. Lev Minsky came in behind him, and his contribution was the most specific of all. He had, in the 14 hours between the briefing and departure, pulled every publication from the hegemony's own xenopediatric literature, the subset of their biological research that dealt with the developmental biology of juvenile sapients. He had cross-referenced it with human developmental literature, and he had found something interesting. The hegemony's own research on sapient juvenile development, research conducted over 400,000 years across multiple species, established that the critical variable in trauma recovery was the speed and quality of reunion with primary attachment figures. The data was not ambiguous. The longer the separation, the harder the recovery. The harder the recovery, the longer the deviation from developmental baseline. And deviation from developmental baseline was, in their own literature, classified as a form of harm. They had, in short, been building a harm case against themselves, with every day they kept the children. "The current separation duration," Lev said, "is 74 hours. Based on the developmental literature in your own archives, the recovery trajectory is still favorable. At 96 hours, certain markers begin to show longer-term deviation. I want to make sure we're all working with the same information about what the clock looks like." Factor Row did not respond immediately. His chemical output shifted, Sierra's device was tracking it. in a direction she'd annotate in her later paper as consistent with the recalibration state, the physiological signature of a mind that has received information it did not expect and is adjusting its model of the situation. He asked Sira a question directly in primary that she translated as, "How long did you require to assemble this group?" 14 hours, Sira said. A pause. From the time of notification. From the time of notification. Another pause longer. Then Factor Rose said, "What is it you are asking for?" Fatima said, "Immediate welfare verification access, a supervised contact schedule while we work toward resolution, and a joint framework for any continuation of the study that meets the consent requirements under the Accord." She did not say we want our children back. She did not say you had no right. She offered him a path out that preserved the research objective, satisfied the legal framework, and let his department avoid the internal consequences of having conducted a study whose results were now confounded by their own methodology. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked for an administrative recess, which in hegemony protocol meant he needed to contact his hierarchy. We waited. Lev made tea from a portable kit he'd brought and distributed it without comment, and we sat in the storage antechamber meeting room and drank tea in the cold greenish light, and nobody said much, and we waited. He came back 40 minutes later. The contact arrangement was approved for an initial period of 2 hours, subject to review. We were escorted to the children's section. The room they were kept in was not a cell. I want to be clear about that, because the story could be told as a rescue from captivity story, and it would be inaccurate and unfair to what actually happened. The room was large. The temperature was within human comfort range. There were items in it, soft furnishings, lighting that someone had clearly attempted to adjust toward human standard spectrum. That indicated the hegemony had tried to make the environment suitable. They had tried, with genuine intention and zero actual information, to make 41 human children comfortable. The result was a room that was comfortable in the same way that a description of comfort is comfortable, technically accurate in the individual elements, wrong in every way that mattered. There were no windows. The lighting was too even, which sounds like a small thing until you spend 3 days in a room with no variation in the light, and you realize that variation in light is how your nervous system tracks the passage of time. The furnishings were soft but sized for a hegemony body, which was 30% larger than a human adult. The food provided was nutritionally complete by the standards of hegemony xenobiology, but had been processed to a consistency and temperature that suggested no one had thought about palatability or preference or the specific comfort a familiar food provides to a frightened child. The children were there, all 41. Most of them were clustered in groups, the small social units that children form automatically when they're frightened and there are no adults. And the clusters had arranged themselves in a rough ring facing the door, which told me something about what the past 74 hours had felt like from inside the room. Lev Minsky walked in ahead of me. He didn't rush. He didn't say anything loudly. He sat down on the floor near the door, cross-legged, which brought him to approximately the eye level of the smaller children, and he waited. He kept his hands visible and relaxed. He looked at the room without focusing on anyone in particular. 2 of the younger ones drifted toward him within about 3 minutes, the way children do, the specific gravitational pull of a calm adult in an uncertain situation, something that bypasses conscious decision entirely and operates at the level of instinct honed over 100,000 years of children surviving, because they could correctly identify which adults were safe. He said their names. He'd memorized all 41. He used their names, the specific names, not the colony roll designations or the incident numbers, just the names their parents had given them, and I watched something happen in the body language of every child within earshot when they heard him use those names with the specificity that meant he knew them, that he'd been told, that someone had cared enough about who they specifically were to tell him. He told them, in the straightforward language you use with children who are frightened, that their families knew where they were, that a lot of people had come, that going home was going to happen soon. He said it without qualifications, without the hedging that adults use when they don't want to make promises they can't keep, because he had spent 74 hours on a shuttle making sure the promises were keepable before he made them. I stood at the edge of the room and watched, and I thought about what it means to know your children's names when you walk into a room. The formal negotiations for the complete return took 3 more days. During those 3 days, the children were moved to a section of the station that Lev had specified, with lighting Thij had specified and temperature Lev had specified, and a daily contact schedule with parents that was conducted via secure transmission and monitored for security, which Danielle Sato had negotiated with the station's security administration, while the rest of us were in the meeting room. Sato had done this with the particular calm efficiency of someone who had extracted humans from uncertain situations before and knew that calm efficiency, communicated clearly to everyone in the administrative chain, reduces friction faster than authority claims do. Fatima drafted the supplementary framework over 2 sleepless days in a room adjacent to the meeting space that the hegemony had provided, which was an upgrade from the storage antechamber, and therefore significant in its own way. She was careful with the language. She was building something that could survive internal hegemony review, which meant she needed to frame every provision in terms of hegemony internal precedent rather than human rights claims, because human rights claims had no legal standing in their system, and hegemony standard welfare obligations did. She was writing their law in a way they could recognize as their own. Yue, the linguistic cryptographer, had been running quiet analysis on the secondary communication layer throughout, the internal protocol that the hegemony's junior administrators used and assumed was outside any outsider's reach. What came through wasn't definitive, but it was informative. The research department that had conducted the study was not fully coordinated with the administrative and legal departments that were now dealing with the consequences. There were internal disagreements. Factor Rho was not alone in finding the situation more complicated than whoever had ordered the study had apparently anticipated. This was useful information. Not because we could act on it directly, using it would compromise UA's access to the channel, but because it told us the internal pressure was already building, and we didn't need to manufacture it. We needed to be clear about what resolution looked like and make sure it was within easy reach. Bashir, the surgeon, had conducted wellness assessments on all 41 children in the first 18 hours of contact access, working alongside the hegemony's own medical staff in a collaboration that was initially tense and became, by the end of the second day, something closer to collegial. There's a specific thing that happens when 2 medics from entirely different biological traditions look at the same patient together and find they agree on the diagnosis. It's not friendship. It's something more functional than friendship. The hegemony medical staff had, by the 3rd day, sought Bashir out to discuss 3 cases that were presenting unusual markers. He had worked with them. He told me later, in the transport corridor outside the children's section, that the hegemony medical staff were good, that they had genuinely been trying to make the children comfortable to the extent of their knowledge, that the gap wasn't cruelty, it was ignorance of specifics, which is a very different problem with very different solutions. They didn't know what comfort looked like for these kids, he said. They knew the biological tolerances but not the texture. Nobody told them. Nobody could have told them because they didn't ask. He paused. They asked me. On the 4th day, the children came home. The families had been brought up in stages, most of them. Some were still in transit from the further colonies. The docking bay had been prepared by Danielle Sato, who had an eye for this that I didn't, and had set up the space so that the moment of reunion had room, so that children could run if they needed to run, so that there was no crowd to navigate or protocol to complete before a parent could reach their child. 41 children came through the door in a loose group, with Lev walking at the outside, and the moment the first one spotted her father across the bay, the formation dissolved instantly and completely, because children know what they're looking for, and when they see it, they don't need anyone's permission to go to it. Priya was 7 years old and had been the first taken, and therefore had been separated from her family the longest. She'd spent 4 days in a room with no windows and no variation in light and soft furnishings, the wrong size and food that was nutritionally complete and wrong in every way that mattered. She was small for 7, with dark braids that had come partially loose over 4 days, and she spotted her father across the bay, and she started running. He was a tall man, colony built, and he was already moving before she reached half the distance, and they met somewhere in the middle of the bay, and I am not going to try to describe what that looked like. I don't have the language. Nobody does. There is a reason that human storytelling keeps returning to certain moments, the reunion, the return, the recognition, because they contain something that language points at without being able to hold. I'll just say that it happened, and that it was the reason 9 people had flown 300 light years and argued for 72 hours in a cold room. Factor Rowe was present in the bay. He had come, and this was, in context, unusual to observe the reunification. He had cited the study, which was still nominally ongoing under the modified framework Fatima had negotiated, but I had stopped believing that was the reason about 2 hours after he'd requested permission to attend. Sira was beside me, watching him, her device running. "What are you reading?" I asked her quietly. She didn't answer for a moment. She was watching the bay, the children and the families and the movement and the sound of it, which was considerable. "I've been trying to map it for 3 days," she said finally. "I have 400 reference points in the literature, and I haven't found the match." She paused. "The closest analog I can find is in the literature on hegemony encounter with novelty responses, when they encounter something they haven't categorized before. Something that doesn't fit the existing framework." I thought about what we'd done, not the arguments or the documents or the expertise, though all of that had been necessary. The thing underneath it, the speed of 72 hours, the specificity of 14 hours, 41 names memorized and used, a lawyer who knew their law better than their administrators, a psychologist who had used their own data to make them understand what the clock looked like. I thought about what it means to care with precision. The hegemony had taken the children because they were interesting, because human neurological development had presented a characteristic they wanted to study, and they had reached out and taken what they wanted to study with the casual confidence of a civilization that had been doing things like this for 400,000 years, and had not encountered a response that surprised them in a very long time. We hadn't been able to threaten them. We hadn't been able to frighten them. We couldn't match their history or their fleets or their 400,000 years of certainty that they were the most significant entity in any room they walked into. What we had been able to do was show them something they hadn't cataloged. Not hostility, not power, something more specifically human. We had shown them what it looks like when a species cares about its children with the specific, organized, tireless precision of an entity that has been optimizing for child survival since before it had language. The entire suite of human behavior that had evolved for exactly this purpose. The speed of response, the accuracy of expertise, the knowledge of names, the lawyer who read 400,000 years of their law so she could speak it back to them in their own grammar. All of it was the same thing. All of it was the same human characteristic, expressed in the specific form that the situation required. We hadn't fought them. We had shown them something they didn't have a category for. I thought about what goes in the category, eventually. I thought about the hegemony's xenological registry updating, somewhere, with a notation that humanity's response to the Curath-7 incident had exhibited characteristics inconsistent with the previous model. I thought about what gets added to the model. I hoped it was the right things. Priya's father found me in the corridor of the transport ship the morning after the reunion. He was a tall man and he looked like he hadn't slept, which made sense. He stood in the corridor and looked at me for a moment and then said, "How?" I didn't know exactly what he was asking. I answered the question that seemed largest. "We knew what to bring," I said. He nodded. The kind of nod that isn't acknowledgement. It's something more like relief, the specific relief of understanding something that had seemed too large to understand. Then he went back to his daughter. I went back to writing my report. The Bureau would review it, file it, and use it to argue for a budget increase they probably wouldn't receive. The supplementary accord framework would go into review and take approximately 2 years to ratify, during which it would technically be provisional but practically binding, because the hegemony's internal review process didn't like retroactive problems. Sierra's paper, which she finished on the transport home, in the 10 hours between Curath-7 and the jump point, because she was the kind of person who finished things, would eventually appear in 2 hegemony academic indices and get a response from a hegemony researcher that she would spend 6 months trying to fully parse. The study was suspended, not canceled. The hegemony doesn't cancel things, they suspend them pending framework compliance, and whether it would resume under the consent process Fatima had drafted was something nobody knew yet. I spent a lot of the return trip in one of the common areas, doing nothing in particular, watching people work, watching Lev make notes, watching Fatima draft framework language in longhand on paper which she preferred. I thought about a species 60 years into interstellar presence, against a civilization 400,000 years old. I thought about what we are specifically, not in the grand narrative sense, not in the sense of humanity's destiny or our place in the cosmos, in the specific, practical, demonstrable sense. What we do when our children are taken, and the entity that took them says, "Be patient." What that sentence does inside us, what it has always done, since before we had starships or treaty frameworks or xenocognitive researchers who build spectrum analyzers in 14 hours. It makes us move, specifically and fast and with exactly the right tools and a list of 41 names that we know. The hegemony has been at this for 400,000 years. They have seen everything, cataloged everything, responded to everything with the calm efficiency of an entity that has outlasted every challenge it has ever encountered. I don't think they've seen this before. I don't think they have a category for it. They're going to need to build one. We're going to keep being in it. There was a second meeting I haven't described, because at the time it felt like background, and it's only in retrospect that I understand what it was. On the second day of negotiations, while Fatima and Factor Row were working through the supplementary framework language and the rest of us were waiting in shifts, I ended up in a corridor adjacent to the children's section with one of the hegemony medical staff. Not by arrangement. He had simply come to check something at the same time I was passing through, and we ended up standing in the corridor, and he looked at me with the specific quality of hegemony attention that is hard to describe but feels, to a human, like being carefully read. He said something in primary that the translation device rendered as a question. "You knew their names?" I told him yes. "Before you arrived," he said, "you knew all of them." "We knew all of them," I said. He was quiet for a moment. His temporal markings shifted in a slow pattern. "We did not know their names," he said. "We had identification numbers assigned at intake. Our protocol does not use personal designations for study subjects. It introduces an inconsistency variable into the observer's data collection." A pause. This was an error. I didn't say anything. "The one who sat on the floor," he said. "The one who used the names. When he used them, the cortisol proxy dropped measurably within approximately 40 seconds. We recorded it. He paused again. We were collecting stress response data. We collected that. What will you do with it? I asked. He made a gesture I didn't have context for. Include it, he said. It is data. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The idea that Lev using 41 children's names became data in a hegemony study. That's somewhere in their research record. There is a notation about what happens to a human child's stress markers when a calm adult uses their specific, personal name in a room that has been wrong in every way for 4 days. I thought about what gets learned over time by a civilization that collects data with that level of precision. I thought about 400,000 years of encountering species, and what the compounded record of all those encounters looks like, and what gets added to it now. We gave them something, in that bay and in that corridor, and in that cold meeting room. We gave them a data point they didn't have, the signature of a species that moves at a speed they didn't anticipate, with a precision they didn't model, toward an objective that is not territorial and is not strategic and is not, in the frameworks they have for understanding alien motivation, readily classifiable. We came for our children. We came with specific expertise and complete preparation, and a list of 41 names and a lawyer who had read their law for 8 months against the possibility that one day she might need to. We came because the word patient, applied to one of our children being somewhere we couldn't see them, is not a word our species knows how to accept. The hegemony medic stood in the corridor, and he had the look of a being recalibrating a model, and I thought about what the model would look like after the recalibration. Not dangerous, not to be avoided, something harder to categorize than either of those. Something that shows up in the storage antechamber with treaty documents and spectrum analyzers and child psychologists who sit on floors, and builds its case out of your own law and your own data and your own 400,000-year ethical tradition, and doesn't leave until it's done. Danielle Sato told me something on the transport home that I've thought about since. She'd been in the Security Administration meetings for 2 days, negotiating the practical logistics of the contact schedule and then the return. She said that the hegemony security staff had been, by the end, cooperative in a way that surprised her, not friendly, not exactly, but invested in getting the practical details right. She said one of them had asked her, on the last day, how long the Bureau's protocols allowed for a case of this type. She told him there were no protocols that anticipated this exact case type, so she'd been building them in real time. He had been quiet for a moment, and then he said in primary something that translated roughly as, "You do this often, build the procedure while executing it." "When we have to," she'd said. She said his temporal markings had done something she couldn't interpret, but it had lasted a long time. I understand it now, I think. 400,000 years of procedure. 400,000 years of doing things the way they have always been done, because the way things have always been done has worked, and what works is worth preserving. And then a species that has been in space for 60 years shows up and builds its procedure in real time, on the move, because it needed one and didn't have one and didn't let that stop it. We're annoying from that perspective. We're genuinely, structurally annoying to deal with because we don't stay in the category we're placed in. We don't behave the way the model predicts. We arrive with lawyers who have read 60,000-year-old documents, and psychologists with portable chemistry analyzers, and surgeons who get collegial with your medical staff, and security chiefs who build protocols while deploying them. And we do all of this in 72 hours because someone took our children. In 100 years, I wonder what the hegemony's catalog will say about us. I wonder which of the things we did in that station will have percolated up through their research divisions and their diplomatic corps training and their administrative precedents. I wonder if Fatima's supplementary framework will have become the model for how other species negotiate with them. Other species, who never thought to read their 60,000-year-old ethics documents, finding suddenly that the document has been found and cited and placed on the table. I wonder if Lev's data point, the one about names and cortisol proxies, will show up in their protocols for handling juvenile sapient subjects. I wonder if there will be a notation, somewhere in their records, that personal designation significantly reduces stress response in human subjects, and that the reduction is measurable within 40 seconds. I wonder if they will apply it to other species, and whether other species will notice, and whether they'll know where it came from. We left something behind in that station, not a monument or a declaration, something more durable, the record of what a species does when it has been told to be patient about its children, and the specific, documented, data-supported shape of what that looks like when humanity decides not to be. They took 41 children. They thought they had time. They thought the response would be slow, because responses from young species are slow, because young species don't yet have the expertise or the coordination or the practice speed. They sent back a message that said, "Be patient." Humanity sent 9 people with 200 years of combined specific expertise, a portable spectrum analyzer built in 14 hours, a stack of physical documents, 60,000-year-old precedents, and 41 names memorized and ready to use. And we were there in 72 hours. Be patient. We were there in 72 hours. I don't think they'll use those words again. Not to us. Not about our children. I think they will look at the data, their own data, running in their own systems, collected with their own instruments during their own study, and they will see the record of what happened when they said be patient, and we decided that patience was not the resource we were going to deploy. We deployed the other thing. The one we've been building since before we had starships or treaty bureaus or a single child who had ever been told their parents were coming. We sent the right people. We knew their names. We came fast. We brought our children home. That's who we are. That is specifically, demonstrably, on the record who we are, and the hegemony has it now in their archives along with everything else they've learned in 400,000 years, and I hope it settles into their records and their curriculum and their diplomatic corps training and their medical protocols, one data point at a time, until the model looks the way it should look. Until the model says, do not take their children, not because they will send warships, because they will send 9 people who know exactly what they're doing, and they will be there before you expect them, and they will know your law and your ethics and your 60,000-year-old documents and the names of every child in the room, and they will not leave without them. The Bureau's formal report on the Curath-7 incident runs to 112 pages. I wrote most of it, with contributions from every member of the team. It covers the legal arguments and their outcomes, the welfare verification procedures, the supplementary framework, the contact schedule, the return logistics. It is dry and specific and correct in every particular, and it will be filed in the Bureau's archives and referenced in every similar case that follows, of which there will be others. There is a section at the back that I added without being asked, and which the Bureau director approved without comment, which surprised me. It's titled Observations on Response Methodology, and it says, in plain language, what I've been trying to say since the moment the shuttle docked and I watched Sira Akafer step forward and speak to 4 hegemony officials in their own language at native-level certainty grading about a subparagraph they hadn't checked. It says that what we did at Curath-7 was not unusual. It was the most human thing possible. It was the expression, in a specific contemporary context, of a behavioral pattern so old and so deeply embedded that it doesn't read as strategy. It reads as nature. The speed, the specificity, the refusal to be categorized as manageable, the use of names, none of it was calculated. It was just what happens when you take our children and we come to get them back. The report recommends that the Bureau expand its roster to include standing expertise in xenojurisprudence, xenocognitive studies, and interspecies child welfare. It recommends maintaining a rapid response capacity. It recommends the specific composition of a 9-person team as a model for future analogous incidents, with flexibility for case-specific expertise. The Budget Committee reviewed the report and requested additional documentation of the cost-benefit case. Fatima sent them Provision 12C, subparagraph 11, annotated. I heard they approved the roster expansion 3 weeks later. I don't know if the annotation was what did it or if they just needed the time. Either way. Sierra's paper came out 6 months after the incident. It was the first human-authored paper to be added to the hegemony's active diplomatic core curriculum in the Bureau's institutional memory, which goes back 40 years. The message she received from the hegemony researcher was polite, precise, and asked 3 specific questions about her methodology that took her another 6 months to answer to her own satisfaction. When she answered them, she published the answers as a follow-up paper. That paper is also in the curriculum. Lev went back to his colony trauma unit. He sent the Bureau a methodology document about reunion phase protocols for cases of prolonged separation, not just for alien jurisdiction cases, but for any case where a child has been separated from family for more than 48 hours. It's standard procedure now. It has the word names in the first paragraph. Fatima is working on 3 other cases. She found 2 more 60,000-year-old hegemony documents while preparing for the second one. Fidge published a study on xenobiological ethics frameworks that cited the Curath-7 supplementary protocol as a model for consent-based research design. He sent a copy to the hegemony research department that had run the original study. They have not responded, which may mean nothing, or may mean they are still reading it. Bashir maintains a correspondence with one of the hegemony medical staff from the station. It is, he tells me, technically a research exchange. They are collaborating on a paper about cross-species developmental baseline assessment. It will be, if it is ever finished, the first jointly authored human hegemony medical paper in existence. I finished the report. I filed it. I came back to work because the Bureau has 47 employees and a budget that couldn't afford a second shuttle, and there are always more children somewhere that a human court can't easily reach. But sometimes, in the middle of something routine, I think about Curath-7. I think about the cold and the green-shifted light and the room that smelled like a cut-circuit board. I think about Fatima turning a page of physical paper in a storage antechamber, and Lev sitting on a floor with his hands visible and relaxed, and Sierra running scenario trees behind closed eyes on the last hour of a 300-light-year shuttle ride. I think about a 7-year-old named Priya running across a docking bay. I think about what the hegemony is going to do with us over the next 100 years, and the 100 years after that, as we keep refusing to be the species they thought we were going to be. As we keep showing up too fast and too specific with too much knowledge of their own law, and the names of all our children memorized and ready. I think about 400,000 years of records, updated now to include us. Updated in the specific, permanent, data-supported way that the hegemony updates things, not with an impression or a guess, but with observations, cross-referenced and filed, and available to every researcher and diplomat and medical staff member who comes after. The record says they came in 72 hours. The record says they knew their law. The record says they knew the names. The record says they did not leave without them. That record is ours now. We put it there. And whatever the hegemony becomes in the next 400,000 years, and whatever species they encounter, and whatever their model evolves into as they accumulate more data across more encounters, that record will still be in the archive. We were there in 72 hours. We knew 41 names. We brought every child home. That is our data point. That is what we left in their records when they took our children and we came to get them back. I think that's enough. I think in 400,000 years, that will be more than enough.